What if the world you knew was a cage, woven not of iron but of invisible rules? What if your worth was decided before you were even born, your dreams irrelevant before they could even bloom? Imagine a life where your spirit was slowly, steadily crushed, not by a single blow, but by the relentless weight of what society expected you to be. Welcome to 1190. Number 12, the unseen walls of social seclusion. Imagine being born into a world where your movements, your very presence, were meticulously controlled, not by a tyrant, but by the unspoken agreements of an entire society. In 1190, for many women, life unfolded almost entirely within unseen walls. If you were a noblewoman, your castle, with its thick stone battlements, was both your refuge and your prison. Your world might extend to the castle grounds, perhaps a nearby chapel, but venturing much further unescorted was simply not done. It was considered dangerous, unseemly, and a direct challenge to the protection your family was meant to provide. Your days were spent overseeing the household, perhaps supervising servants, working on intricate needlework, or tending to the needs of your children. Chroniclers of the time often detail the exploits of men knights riding forth, merchants traveling distant lands, scholars debating in bustling cities, but the stories of women frequently remain confined to the domestic sphere. Even for women of the peasant class, though their physical labor might take them into the fields or the village market, their social world was often remarkably constricted. Their interactions were primarily with family, immediate neighbors, and the few figures of authority in their small community, such as the local priest or the Lord's bailiff. The broader world with its diverse people and ideas was a distant, often frightening concept, spoken of in hushed tones or through the filtered accounts of traveling peddlers. Scholars analyzing what little personal correspondence survives from this era often note the remarkable lack of outward-looking references in women's letters, contrasting sharply with the wider scope of male communications. This profound social seclusion meant that women were largely denied the opportunity to explore, to discover, to engage with the sheer breadth of human experience. Could not travel freely, could not embark on pilgrimages without male guardians, could not attend distant universities, or participate in the thriving trade routes that connected burgeoning towns. This limitation was not just about physical space, it was about the mental and spiritual space available to them. Without exposure to diverse perspectives, without the chance to test their own ideas against a wider tapestry of thought, their understanding of the world, and indeed of themselves, remained severely constrained. The world outside was a tantalizing mystery, a place of adventure and learning that was simply not theirs to inhabit. The longing for something more, for a glimpse beyond the familiar, must have been a constant, quiet ache for many a woman whose spirit yearned for the freedom of the open road, a freedom reserved almost exclusively for men. This invisible barrier, though rarely codified in law, was perhaps one of the most pervasive and insidious pressures, subtly dimming the light of ambition and curiosity in countless female hearts. Number 11, the protection of family honor. In the year 1190, a woman's purity was not just a personal virtue, it was the very bedrock of her family's reputation, a shimmering shield against social scorn and shame. The concept of family honor was an immense, pervasive force, and a woman's conduct was seen as its most vulnerable point, its most easily tarnished surface. A woman's modesty, her chastity, and her obedience were paramount, not just for her own soul, but for the standing of her entire kin. If a daughter or a sister deviated from the strict codes of behavior, if she was perceived to be unchaste or disobedient, it was not merely her own name that suffered. The stain of dishonor would spread like wildfire through the family line, affecting brothers, fathers, and even distant relatives. This intense societal scrutiny meant that women lived under a constant, crushing pressure to conform, to never falter, to never bring shame upon their name. Consider the daughter of a prominent merchant, whose family's reputation relied heavily on their respectable standing within the town. If she were to engage in any behavior deemed scandalous, even something as simple as speaking too freely with an unrelated man in public, whispers could begin. These whispers, fueled by rumor and suspicion, could undermine her father's business dealings, diminish her brother's marriage prospects, and even cast a shadow over her younger sister's future dowries. Historical anecdotes from the period, though often vague, hint at the severe consequences faced by women who transgressed these unwritten rules. They could be ostracized, confined, or even sent away to convents, not as a spiritual calling, but as a means to hide the family's shame. This societal expectation created an environment where a woman's personal desires, her natural impulses, and her independent spirit were constantly suppressed. She was not primarily an individual with her own dreams and aspirations, but rather a vessel for upholding the family's collective honor. Her very identity became intertwined with this fragile, easily shattered concept. Fear of dishonor was a silent, persistent torment, forcing women into a constrained existence where every word, every gesture, every interaction was weighed against the potential for social ruin. The burden of this responsibility, placed almost entirely upon her shoulders, must have been immense. It demanded a constant vigilance, a perpetual self-denial, and a willing surrender of personal agency for the sake of a collective identity. The joy of spontaneity, the freedom of genuine expression, and the simple liberty of being oneself were often sacrificed on the altar of family honor, leaving many a woman's spirit dampened by the weight of unspoken expectations and the ever-present threat of societal judgment. Number 10. Domestic duties as sole domain. Imagine a life where your worth was almost exclusively measured by your ability to manage a household, to cook, to clean, to sew, and to raise children. In 1190, for the vast majority of women, these domestic duties were not just important tasks, they were their very purpose, their defining role in society. From the highest noblewoman to the humblest peasant, the expectation was that a woman's sphere of influence and responsibility began and ended within the walls of her home or the boundaries of her family's farm. Contributions to society were viewed almost entirely through the lens of her domestic efficiency and her capacity for nurturing. For the peasant woman, this meant backbreaking labor from dawn till dusk. She was expected to cook over an open hearth, often preparing simple but hearty meals for a large family. She would bake bread, churn butter, and preserve food for the long, lean winter months. Her hands would be calloused from grinding grain, her back aching from drawing water from the well. She would spin wool into thread, weave it into rough cloth, and then sew garments for her entire family, patching and mending them until they could no longer hold together. Beyond the walls of her small dwelling, she was likely involved in agricultural work, helping in the fields, tending to small livestock, or gathering firewood. Her days were a relentless cycle of physical exertion, her skills entirely practical and essential for survival. Records from manorial estates, though primarily focused on male laborers, indirectly highlight the indispensable role of women in the daily functioning of these self-sufficient communities. Even for the noblewoman, though freed from the physical drudgery, her days were similarly structured around domestic management. She would oversee a large household, direct numerous servants, manage the stores of food and provisions, and ensure the smooth running of the castle. She might engage in intricate embroidery or tapestry work, manage the household accounts, and supervise the education of her children. While she might possess knowledge of herbs for medicine or basic literacy, her intellectual pursuits were often seen as secondary to her role as mistress of the household. Historical documents, such as inventories of castle goods, reveal the immense complexity and value placed on the domestic sphere, a domain largely controlled by women. This singular focus on domesticity meant that any aspirations a woman might have had beyond these confines were often dismissed as impractical or even inappropriate. There was little social validation for pursuing careers in trade, law, scholarship, or governance, all of which were firmly entrenched as male preserves. The constant grind of household chores, the relentless demands of childcare, and the sheer physicality of maintaining a medieval home left little room for personal development or for the pursuit of individual passions. The expectation that her entire being should be dedicated to the well-being of her family, expressed through her domestic labor, could feel stifling. It was a life of service, often unheralded, where her spirit might long for creative expression or intellectual challenge, only to be met with the unwavering societal decree that her hands and mind were best suited for the hearth and home, leaving many women feeling confined and their potential untapped. Number 9. Subservience to men. Imagine being born into a world where your voice held less weight, your opinions were secondary, and your decisions were always subject to a higher authority, simply because you were female. In 1190, the bedrock of societal structure was an unwavering hierarchy, where women, regardless of their social standing, were expected to be subservient to men. From childhood, a girl learned that her father was her ultimate authority, his word law within the household. Upon marriage, this authority seamlessly transferred to her husband, who became her lord and master in every sense of the word. Even her brothers often held more sway than she did within the family unit. This pervasive expectation of female subservience permeated every aspect of life, shaping interactions, limiting autonomy, and frequently dimming the light of individual spirit. This subservience was not merely a matter of social custom. It was often codified in law and reinforced by religious teachings. Legal customs of the time, such as those found in early English common law, generally placed married women under the legal coverture of their husbands, meaning their legal identity was largely subsumed by his. A married woman could not typically own property in her own name, enter into contracts, or represent herself in court without her husband's consent or involvement. Her earnings, if she had any, were legally his. This complete legal dependence meant that a woman's economic and personal decisions were almost entirely at the mercy of her male guardian. Even widows who gained a degree of legal autonomy upon their husband's death often faced immense pressure to remarry quickly, thus returning to a state of subservience. The spiritual realm also reinforced this hierarchy. Church doctrines, heavily influenced by interpretations of Scripture, often presented women as inherently weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and in need of male guidance. Sermons would emphasize a wife's duty to obey her husband, mirroring the obedience owed to God. This theological underpinning added a layer of divine justification to the societal expectation, making it incredibly difficult for women to challenge their subordinate position without risking both social condemnation and spiritual damnation. Historical treatises on marriage and family life from the period consistently outline the husband's authority and the wife's duty of obedience, portraying this dynamic as natural and God-ordained. This constant, pervasive expectation of subservience meant that women rarely had the opportunity to cultivate their own leadership skills, to express dissenting opinions, or to pursue paths that deviated from the will of the men in their lives. Their intellectual contributions were often unacknowledged, their strategic insights overlooked, and their personal desires frequently sacrificed. The knowledge that her agency was limited, that her voice might be ignored, and that her life choices were ultimately controlled by another could be deeply demoralizing. Chipped away at a woman's self-worth, fostered a sense of powerlessness, and often led to a quiet resignation, where dreams of independence and self-determination were quietly, sadly, put aside. The spirit, however resilient, could not help but feel diminished under such an unyielding and pervasive weight of male dominance. Number 8. Childbearing risks and high mortality. Imagine living in a constant state of quiet dread, knowing that one of the most fundamental aspects of womanhood, the act of bringing new life into the world, could very well be the end of your own. In 1190, the miracle of childbirth was inextricably linked with immense danger. There were no modern medical advancements, no sterile environments, no trained doctors to assist. Childbirth was a deeply perilous journey, a threshold between life and death that countless women crossed, often with fatal consequences. This ever-present risk of mortality during labor and the high likelihood of losing children in infancy cast a long, dark shadow over a woman's life, profoundly impacting her emotional and spiritual well-being. Records, though sparse and often indirect, from parish registers and monastic chronicles, hint at the tragically common occurrences of women dying in childbirth. It was a leading cause of death for women in their childbearing years. Imagine the fear every pregnant woman must have carried, not just for the life she was carrying, but for her own. Every new pregnancy brought with it a fresh wave of anxiety, a silent prayer that she would survive the ordeal. The birthing process itself was often protracted and agonizing, attended only by untrained female midwives and supportive female relatives, relying on traditional remedies and superstitions rather than medical science. Sepsis, hemorrhage, and exhaustion were rampant killers, claiming lives with relentless frequency. The knowledge that her body, designed for this very purpose, could betray her so fatally was a crushing burden. Beyond the threat to the mother, there was the heartbreaking reality of high infant and child mortality rates. It was not uncommon for a woman to bear many children, only to see half or more of them succumb to illness, accident, or malnutrition before reaching adulthood. Measles, smallpox, dysentery, and countless other diseases swept through communities, particularly vulnerable to the young. Imagine the emotional toll of carrying a child for 9 months, enduring the agony of childbirth, only to watch that precious life fade within weeks, months, or a few short years. Historical accounts from families of the time often list numerous children born but fewer surviving, a testament to this grim reality. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and mourning created a profound sense of vulnerability and loss. This relentless exposure to death, both her own potential demise and the certain sorrow of losing beloved children, left an indelible mark on women's spirits. It fostered a deep sense of fragility, a quiet despair, and perhaps a reluctance to invest fully in the joy of each new life, knowing that it could be snatched away so quickly. The emotional energy expended on these cycles of hope and grief was immense. The knowledge that her life was inherently tied to such immense physical danger and profound emotional suffering, all for the purpose of procreation, was a heavy cross to bear, leading many women to a life tinged with an underlying current of sadness and resignation. The vibrant spark of a woman's spirit was often dimmed by the looming specter of the birthing bed and the empty cradle. Number 7. Religious piety and obedience. Imagine a spiritual doctrine that, while offering salvation, also meticulously defined your place as inherently subordinate, constantly reminding you of a perceived ancestral sin. In 1190, the Christian Church held immense sway over every aspect of life, and its teachings profoundly shaped the expectations placed upon women. While offering a path to grace and spiritual solace, the Church also reinforced many of the societal constraints that crushed women's spirits, emphasizing piety, humility, and unwavering obedience above all else, especially for the female sex. Central to this was the pervasive narrative of Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. According to common interpretations of scripture and theological treatises of the time, Eve was portrayed as the weaker vessel, the one who succumbed to temptation and brought sin into the world. This narrative cast a long shadow over all women, branding them, in a sense, with a shared burden of original transgression. Sermons frequently reminded congregations of Eve's culpability, often presenting women as inherently more prone to temptation, more susceptible to the devil's wiles, and therefore in need of constant moral guidance and male supervision. This deeply ingrained theological perspective contributed to the belief that women should be modest, silent, and submissive, lest they lead men astray or fall prey to their own supposed weaknesses. It was a constant, subtle accusation that diminished women's inherent worth in the spiritual hierarchy. The Church also provided a very limited set of acceptable roles for women. The primary path was marriage and motherhood, seen as a sacred duty to procreate and raise Christian children. For those who did not marry, or whose spiritual devotion was exceptionally strong, the convent offered an alternative. Within the convent walls, women could pursue intellectual and spiritual pursuits, but even here, they were generally under the authority of male clergy, and their influence rarely extended beyond the cloister. For the vast majority, the domestic sphere and pious devotion were the only sanctioned avenues for a meaningful life. Any deviation from these roles was often viewed with suspicion, potentially even as heresy. Historical accounts of female mystics or independent religious thinkers, though rare, often detail the immense scrutiny and challenges they faced from male ecclesiastical authorities. This powerful combination of theological teachings and societal expectations meant that women's spiritual lives were often shaped by a pervasive sense of guilt, an emphasis on self-denial, and a constant need for external validation of their piety. The pursuit of spiritual fulfillment, though sincere for many, often came intertwined with the crushing burden of striving for an unattainable ideal of purity and obedience, while simultaneously being reminded of their inherent fallen nature. The vibrant spiritual energy that could have propelled women to greater intellectual and social heights was often redirected inward, consumed by an intense focus on personal penance and humble devotion. The joy of a free and unburdened spirit found little room to flourish under such a strict and often self-deprecating religious framework, leading many to a quiet, dutiful piety that, while perhaps offering salvation, simultaneously diminished their earthly vitality. Number 6. Limited education and intellectual pursuits. Imagine possessing a sharp mind, a keen curiosity, and a yearning for knowledge, only to be denied the means to cultivate them, simply because of your gender. In 1190, the pathways to education and intellectual pursuits were almost exclusively reserved for men, creating a profound and pervasive barrier that crushed the spirits of countless women. For the vast majority, formal schooling was an impossibility, and even basic literacy was a privilege rarely extended to girls. This systemic denial of intellectual development meant that women's minds, though often brilliant and capable, were left largely fallow, unable to blossom into their full potential. For girls from peasant families, the concept of schooling was entirely foreign. Their education was practical, learned at their mother's side, how to cook, clean, spin, weave, care for children, and work the land. Their days were filled with physical labor, not lessons from books. For merchant or artisan families, a girl might learn basic numeracy to help with household accounts, or perhaps some simple reading of religious texts, but anything beyond that was typically seen as unnecessary and even detrimental to her future role as a wife and mother. Focus was on practical skills that ensured a good marriage and a functioning household, not on fostering critical thinking or academic excellence. Historical records, such as guild regulations, occasionally mention women participating in trades, but their formal training was usually informal, passed down within the family, and did not involve broader scholarly learning. Even among the nobility, where boys might receive an education in Latin, history, rhetoric, and even military strategy, girls' education was markedly different. A noblewoman might learn to read and write in her vernacular language, often French or English, and certainly be instructed in religious texts. She would be taught manners, household management, music, and perhaps some basic medical knowledge from herbal remedies. However, access to the classical texts, philosophical debates, and legal principles that formed the core of a male scholar's education was almost entirely denied. Few exceptions were often within monastic orders, where women in convents could indeed become highly literate and even engage in scholarly copying or illuminated manuscript creation. This was a niche path, accessible only to a select few who had chosen a life of religious devotion. This widespread lack of educational opportunity meant that women were often barred from professions that required learning, from positions of intellectual influence, and from contributing to the broader intellectual discourse of the age. Their ideas remained unwritten, their arguments unheard, and their potential inventions unrealized. Quiet frustration of a curious mind starved of knowledge, the yearning for books and debates, the desire to understand the world beyond the immediate confines of their lives must have been a profound source of sadness. The spirit, inherently driven to learn and grow, was often stifled by this societal oversight. It was a silent tragedy, where countless brilliant minds were left unpolished, their intellectual potential allowed to wither, simply because society believed a woman's intelligence was best confined to the domestic sphere, leaving a deep sense of unfulfilled possibility. Number 5. Physical appearance standards. Imagine living in a world where your very appearance was under constant scrutiny, not just for beauty, but for virtue, for social standing, and for the likelihood of a suitable match. In 1190, while there was no concept of modern fashion magazines or widespread beauty trends as we understand them, women were still subjected to strict societal expectations regarding their physical appearance. These standards were deeply intertwined with modesty, social status, and the perceived worth of a woman, often crushing her spirit by demanding conformity over individuality and subtly judging her moral character based on her outward presentation. Modesty was paramount. All women, from peasant to noble, clothing was expected to be demure, covering the body almost entirely. Long gowns, sleeves, and head coverings were standard, with hair almost always covered once a woman was married, or even before, to signify maidenly purity. Revealing clothing was not just frowned upon, it was considered a sign of immorality, associating a woman with loose morals and bringing shame upon her family. This constant emphasis on concealing the body, on projecting an image of piety and humility, meant that a woman's natural form was often hidden, her personal style subsumed by the dictates of conformity. Even a simple desire to wear a brighter color or a slightly different style could be met with disapproval, stemming from the deeply ingrained belief that outward appearance reflected inner virtue. Religious texts and sermons of the era often warned against vanity and excessive ornamentation, further reinforcing the pressure to be modest and unadorned. Beyond modesty, appearance was also linked to social status and marriageability. For noblewomen, the expectation was to appear well-fed and healthy, signaling their family's prosperity and their ability to bear healthy children. Pale skin was often desired, indicating a life of leisure shielded from the sun, unlike the tan complexions of working peasant women. Peasant women, their appearance was dictated by practicality and hard labor, but they too were expected to be clean and neat within their means, reflecting a well-ordered home and a diligent character. A woman's appearance was part of her dowry, a visual resume for potential suitors and their families. Any perceived flaw, disfigurement, or even a deviation from the expected look could diminish her prospects or lead to social ostracization. Historical medical texts of the time, though rudimentary, often discussed various physical traits in women in terms of their suitability for marriage and childbearing, highlighting the societal focus on these aspects. This relentless pressure to adhere to specific appearance standards, driven by a complex interplay of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and marital expectations, was a significant burden. It stripped women of the freedom to express themselves through their personal presentation, reducing their bodies to symbols of virtue or status. Quiet anxiety of being judged, the subtle critiques, and the constant need to police one's own image could be deeply demoralizing. A woman's spirit, longing for self-expression and genuine acceptance, was often forced into a mold, leaving her feeling like an object to be evaluated rather than a unique individual with her own inherent beauty and worth, leading to a constant, unspoken sense of self-consciousness and a diminished sense of personal autonomy. Number 4, dowry expectations. Imagine your very eligibility for marriage, your future security, and your family's financial standing hinging upon a sum of money or goods that your family had to provide. In 1190, the dowry was not merely a tradition. It was a fundamental, unyielding expectation that profoundly impacted a woman's life and often crushed her spirit. It was the financial contribution a bride's family made to her new husband's family, ostensibly to help establish the new household or to provide for the wife if she were widowed. However, in practice, it often functioned as a direct cost of marriage, a necessary hurdle that determined a woman's prospects and sometimes her worth. For a family with several daughters, the burden of accumulating dowries could be immense, consuming years of savings and resources. Daughters became, in a sense, a financial liability, a drain on the family's coffers. If the family could not assemble a sufficient dowry, a daughter's marriage prospects would diminish drastically, potentially leaving her without a husband, without social standing, and without the means to secure her future. This situation was particularly dire for women from less affluent backgrounds, where even a small dowry could be a monumental challenge. Chronicles from the era sometimes mention the difficulties faced by families attempting to marry off daughters without adequate resources, often resulting in daughters entering service or even, in extreme cases, a life of destitution. The size of the dowry also directly impacted the quality of the marriage a woman could secure. A larger dowry could attract a more desirable husband, perhaps one from a higher social standing, or with more land or a more prosperous trade. Conversely, a smaller dowry might relegate a woman to a less advantageous match, or even no match at all. This meant that a woman's inherent qualities, her character, her intelligence, her skills, often took a backseat to the financial contribution her family could provide. Personal worth became inextricably linked to a monetary sum, a transactional value placed upon her future. This could lead to intense pressure on young women to perform in ways that maximized their family's investment, to be docile, agreeable, and conventionally appealing, further stifling their individuality. The expectation of a dowry placed a silent, yet immense, psychological burden on women. They knew they were a financial undertaking for their families, and that their future was dependent on this often considerable sum. Fear of being a burden or of not being worth enough to secure a good match could be deeply demoralizing. It created a constant anxiety about her marital prospects and her long-term security. The ideal of love and partnership, though present in some romantic narratives of the time, often faded in the harsh light of economic reality. Dowry system, while ensuring some financial stability for the new couple, ultimately treated women as commodities in a transaction, diminishing their spirits by tying their future to a price tag, and often making them feel less like individuals and more like economic assets. Number 3, limited property rights. Imagine a world where everything you owned, everything you inherited, even your own earnings, were not truly yours, but belonged to a man, your father, your husband, your brother. In 1190, the legal and customary systems of the time severely restricted women's property rights, especially for married women. This systemic denial of economic autonomy was a profound constraint, leaving women vulnerable, dependent, and often with a deep sense of powerlessness that chipped away at their spirits. Under the prevailing legal system, particularly common law emerging in England, a married woman effectively lost her independent legal identity. This concept, known as coverture, meant that her legal existence was covered by that of her husband. Any property she owned before marriage, whether inherited land or personal belongings, became his upon their union. Any wages she earned through her labor were legally his. She could not buy or sell property, enter into contracts, or manage her own finances without her husband's consent and involvement. If she inherited land after marriage, it typically became part of her husband's estate, though she might retain certain dower rights to use a portion of it for her sustenance if she became a widow. Charters and deeds from the period almost universally list men as property owners and transactional parties, with women only appearing in specific, limited capacities, such as granting a dowry or receiving dower. This lack of independent property rights meant that women were often entirely dependent on their male relatives for economic security. If a husband was irresponsible, abusive, or simply poor at managing resources, his wife had little recourse. She could not sell off her own ancestral land to support her children, nor could she invest in a business venture to improve her family's lot. Financial well-being was almost entirely tied to the competence and benevolence of her husband. Even in cases where women from wealthy families brought substantial dowries, these assets typically came under the husband's control, further cementing her dependent status. The situation was somewhat different for unmarried women and widows, who often had more legal capacity to own and manage property. A single woman or a widow could inherit, buy, and sell land or goods. However, these women often faced intense social pressure to marry or remarry, thus returning to the state of coverture. The social stigma of being an unmarried woman, or the economic vulnerabilities of a widow managing a large estate alone, often pushed them back into a system where their rights were curtailed. This constant threat of losing autonomy, or the reality of having it stripped away upon marriage, was a persistent source of anxiety. The spiritual toll of being treated as a perpetual minor, of having no true ownership over one's own resources, and of living in a state of financial dependency was immense. It fostered a deep sense of vulnerability, curtailed dreams of independence, and diminished a woman's sense of self-worth, making her feel less like a sovereign individual and more like an extension of her male guardians. Number 2, arranged marriages. Imagine a world where the most significant decision of your life, who you would spend your days with, build a family with, and share your destiny with, was made not by you, but by your parents or guardians. In 1190, arranged marriages were the overwhelmingly dominant norm across all social strata, from the highest nobility to the humblest peasantry. This pervasive practice was less about individual desire and more about strategic alliances, economic advantage, and social stability, frequently crushing a woman's spirit by denying her the fundamental right to choose her partner and shaping her future without her consent. For noble families, marriage was a vital tool for securing power, consolidating land, and forging political alliances. Daughter was a valuable commodity, her hand in marriage a pawn in a larger game of influence. Parents would meticulously negotiate marriage contracts, considering factors like the size of the dowry, the extent of the prospective husband's lands, his family's lineage, and his strategic importance. Feelings or preferences of the young woman involved were often secondary, if considered at all. Historical documents, such as marriage contracts from this period, are often dry, legalistic texts outlining property transfers and political agreements, with little to no mention of the individuals involved beyond their names. A noblewoman might be sent off to marry a man she had never met, from a distant region, her entire life uprooted based on a decision made by others for the benefit of her family's standing. Even for commoners, arranged marriages were prevalent, albeit for different reasons. Peasants, a marriage might be arranged to combine small plots of land, to secure labor for a farm, or to strengthen family ties within a village. Artisans, it might be a way to expand a business or to pass on a trade. While there might be slightly more opportunity for young people to know each other within a small community, the ultimate decision rested with the parents, who prioritized economic viability and social suitability over emotional connection. The idea of marrying for love was largely a concept confined to courtly romances, not the reality of everyday life. This widespread practice meant that many women entered into lifelong unions with strangers or near strangers, having little to no say in the matter. The potential for happiness or misery was a lottery. Imagine the profound sense of helplessness, the quiet despair of knowing your fate was sealed by others, without your input. A woman's hopes for a loving companion, for a shared future based on mutual affection, were often dashed before they even formed. She was expected to be dutiful, to make the best of her situation, and to bear children for a man chosen for her. Frustration of being unable to direct her own life, of having her deepest personal connection dictated by external forces, was a significant burden. The spirit yearning for connection and personal choice was often subdued by the rigid, unyielding hand of familial and societal expectation, leading to a life lived out of duty rather than genuine desire, leaving many a woman with a sense of unfulfilled longing and a quiet resignation to her fate. Number 1. Mandatory marriage and motherhood. Imagine a world where your ultimate purpose, your highest calling, your very definition of worth, was not a choice you made, but a destiny prescribed for you from birth, to become a wife and above all a mother. In 1190, the expectation of mandatory marriage and subsequent motherhood was an overwhelming societal force, shaping every aspect of a woman's life and often crushing her spirit by denying her any alternative path to fulfillment or social acceptance. This was not merely a strong preference, it was the almost universal and undisputed trajectory for women, seen as their natural and God-given role. From the moment a girl was born, her future as a wife and mother was assumed, meticulously planned for, and instilled in her through every lesson and every interaction. Upbringing focused on preparing her for these roles, learning domestic skills, understanding her duties within a household, and embracing the idea of procreation. For society, a woman's primary value lay in her ability to marry and bear children, particularly sons, who would carry on the family name, inherit property, and provide labor. A woman who did not marry, or who married but remained childless, was often viewed with pity, suspicion, or even scorn. She was seen as failing in her fundamental purpose, a burden on her family, or incomplete as a person. Historical records, such as wills and legal documents, often implicitly reinforce this by detailing inheritances and arrangements almost exclusively through male lines, with women primarily defined by their marital or maternal status. This intense societal pressure meant that women rarely had the luxury of considering other life paths. The idea of pursuing a career outside the domestic sphere, of dedicating oneself to scholarship, art, or trade, or of simply remaining unmarried by choice, was largely unthinkable and unsupported. The only widely accepted alternative to marriage and motherhood was entry into a religious order, becoming a nun. While offering spiritual solace and a degree of intellectual freedom, this path was often chosen for religious devotion, or as a convenient option for women who could not secure a suitable marriage, perhaps due to lack of dowry or physical disability. It was not a freely chosen alternative that offered the same social validation as marriage. The profound impact of this mandatory expectation on a woman's spirit cannot be overstated. It meant that her personal aspirations, her unique talents, and her individual desires often had to be suppressed or reshaped to fit this narrow, predetermined mold. If a woman yearned for a life of intellectual pursuit, or felt no strong maternal instinct, or simply desired independence, she was faced with a stark choice: conform to societal expectations and potentially sacrifice her true self, or face ostracization and a life of social obscurity. The weight of this expectation, the relentless drumbeat of societal approval tied to marriage and childbirth, could be incredibly heavy. It could lead to a quiet despair, a sense of having one's destiny prescribed rather than chosen, and a persistent feeling that her intrinsic worth was conditional on her ability to fulfill these specific roles, leaving many a woman's spirit quietly yearning for a life that was simply not hers to have.